everyone. My name is Michael Watson. I'm with 1stGenYale and pleased to be here with you for how to break into competitive PhD programs. And we're going to have introductions shortly. This is Nick Sturdell's program. He's going to introduce his panelists. But we're very excited about your being here tonight. This is a very important topic. And the idea behind this is to have graduate students who've gotten into competitive programs talk directly to students and answer your honest questions regarding what the process is really like about applying and other aspects of that. And just very quickly, I want to introduce a few other people in the room. Annie, can you introduce everyone else? You, Jackson, and I can't see everyone, so.
Annie Friedman, class of 1978, Yale School of Medicine. Ooh. Any questions you have in public health? Any questions you have? Welcome. I'd like to also extend it over to Jackson, and I'm a member of the 1stGen board, and we're really thrilled to be here today.
Hi everyone, I'm Jackson Higginbottom, pronounced he, him. I also graduated from the School of Public Health 2020, and I now work for the CDC Foundation, doing vaccine work here in Canada. And I'm also on the board. Who's next?
And Corinne, did you want to say hello? I know everyone knows you already, but.
Sorry, what did you say, Michael?
Oh, did you want to introduce yourself? I assume everybody knows you already, though.
No, not necessarily. So hi, everybody. I am Karen Gosling. I'm the director of the Office of Educational Opportunity. We do a lot of support for our 1stGen students through FGLI 5, as well as the general support we offer students through the Office of Educational Opportunity. And it's so exciting to host everyone at the Poorvu Center and continue this great partnership we have going with 1stGenYale.
Well, thank you, everyone else. We're going to introduce everyone else on the screen a little bit later, but Nick, we're going to turn it over to you. Go ahead and get started.
Excellent. So just a very short introduction. My name is Nicholas Sturdell. I'm working on my PhD here in psychology and neuroscience. I'm actually going to be graduating this year, so it's bittersweet, but excited to be thinking about it. And I decided to put together this panel because as a 1stGen college student, I noticed that there were a lot of informational barriers, financial barriers, and just general knowledge gaps between where I was in undergrad and where I wanted to go to a PhD program. And so I thought that it might be a good idea to bring together 3 students, one in the physical sciences, one in the social sciences, and one in the humanities, to be able to answer some of the basic foundational questions about getting into the PhD program world. And then we'll be drilling into specifics that are being offered by the audience this evening. So we can start actually with the gentleman who's right beside me, Francisco Diaz-Scalado. If you'd like to just provide a little bit of a brief intro. He's working on his PhD in environmental health science at the Yale School of Public Health.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Francisco Diaz-Scalado, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the School of Public Health in the Department of Environmental Sciences. So I'm actually Puerto Rican, and I'm a 1stGen grad student. And what else?
Whatever, your research interest.
My research interest. So I currently do research studying how extreme temperatures affect human health. I'm currently focusing on Puerto Rico, but I would like to focus kind of like in the Caribbean.
Super relevant. So as we look over to the screen, we have 2 folks who are joining us from other sides of the country. And we're lucky to have both of them because they're 1stGenYale undergrad graduates that did just exactly what you all are trying to do. They overcame the barriers and broke into fantastic PhD programs. Starting first, on the left side, we have Josh Beal, who is doing his PhD at Johns Hopkins. So Josh, if you wouldn't mind just providing a little introduction.
Absolutely. So like Nick so kindly said, I'm Josh Beal. I'm currently at Johns Hopkins. I'm in their cell molecular developmental biology biophysics program. Most recently, I've been doing research on single particle biophysics and looking at how those influence lattice assembly dynamics during HIV virion budding. But as I'm a first-year rotation student, I am soon moving on to another project.
Fantastic. And our humanist, Lydia Burleson, is joining us from Stanford, where she's working on her PhD in English.
Hi, I am Lydia. Use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a third year in my program in English at Stanford. I also have a Knight Hennessy Fellowship, so if folks have questions about applying to fellowships. And I also applied to grad school twice. So my first time applying, I did not get in anywhere. So happy to talk about that as well. I graduated from Yale in 2021 with a degree in English, and I did a nonfiction writing concentration. I also worked a lot with the Poorvu Center, so it's nice to like see the space again. And I'm currently working on what will hopefully be my dissertation. So my work looks at representations of poverty and labor across 20th century American literature. So thinking about the relationship between like what this representation is doing and social outcomes. So like how that actually relates to people's lived experience in poverty in America. And yeah, I'm first gen low income, originally from rural Texas, first in my family to go to college, first to go to grad school. So also very happy to speak from that experience, especially for the humanities, which is one of the most privileged PhD programs. Actually, there have been studies that econ and the humanities have the most people whose parents also have not just college degrees, but graduate degrees. So it is very, like, I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate your introductions. And so I think it might be a good idea to jump right in. So I have some fairly structured questions to kind of get the conversation started, to allow people to have different ideas percolate, and then we can jump into audience questions. So I guess the way that we'll be structuring this is I'll be asking a question, and whoever wants to jump in first can, and then we can kind of disperse through there. So starting with entering the PhD process, how did you even determine that a PhD was right for you? So in this room, we have many students that are currently finishing their undergrads at Yale. It's a degree that's going to open up almost every door for them. And PhD programs have a massive opportunity cost, right? It's 4 to 6 years of some of the most productive years of your life. And one question might be, what kind of crazy person is going to make the sacrifice to go into a PhD program? What was your motivation? What drew you in that direction?
I'll go ahead and jump in here. So for me, there were actually two big aspects to my choice, both a professional side of things and a personal side of things. I'll start with the professional one. So firstly, I've planned for a very long time to pursue a career in teaching at the undergraduate level. I mean, even before I started my bachelor's degree, and doing so in my field is very much the kind of thing that requires a PhD. So for me, there was never really any option but to get a PhD as part of a necessary career development plan. And then secondly, on the more personal side of things, my wife is pursuing her MD, and it aligns our career timelines much more closely if I also pursue graduate education.
I can go next, I guess. The first time I applied to the PhD, I was still a senior at Yale. It was COVID, and I was really reckoning with what I wanted to do after I left the university. And that was a conversation that I was having in summer of 2020, so right when I was entering senior year. And it was very overwhelming to have to try and figure out what exactly applying to the PhD looked like, not knowing what the timelines were, and then trying to manage that while also being a student. There is definitely like a hidden curriculum there, so I'm hoping that we can dive into that a little bit if folks have questions. And yeah, for me, it was like really feeling drawn to the idea of research and scholarship, and really feeling, even in my classes at Yale, that there were things that weren't being talked about that I was really interested in literature in particular. And I think that has proven to be true. That is really like my entry point into my scholarship, looking at the ways in which the field has been limited by not having people from diverse backgrounds. Like, what does it actually mean if the people doing the scholarship don't actually know what it's like to be poor in this country? So yeah, that was kind of my driver, and initial experience didn't get in the first time around. And so then I had to really reckon if I really wanted to do that and apply again and think about what that meant for me as a first gen person.
So for me, it's kind of like a different kind of story because I didn't actually know that I wanted to do a PhD until the last minute in my senior year. But I guess that I personally, for me, the reason why I chose to do the PhD it was because it was the step that made sense at the moment. I had 4 years of research experience, and sometimes I worked very closely with this professor, and she motivated me to pursue the PhD at the end, like right at the beginning of my senior year, because sometimes you don't want the student to kind of like lose all this time and resources that they have employing you. So I was actually considering taking a gap year and then figure out what I wanted to do. So at the end, it just felt the next step that it was right for me.
Yeah, it's interesting that these three themes are going to come up again and again when you're asking different people who are in professor positions or who are currently doing PhDs, and why the PhD. Either practical, I had to, emotional, I loved it, and this is the kind of work that I wanted to be invested in, or through a mentor who saw something in you that maybe you didn't see. And while you guys are in your undergrad experience, if a professor's tapping you and saying you might be good for this role, they might know something that you don't. So going to the point that Lydia brought up about the hidden curriculum, right? There's a big difference between what makes an exceptional undergraduate applicant, right? Good test scores, good high school, good holistic candidate background, right? Playing an instrument or playing a sport, that as opposed to what makes an exceptional PhD student application. And I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on what those differences are and what you did during your undergraduate time to develop these skills necessary to be a competitive PhD student to land where you are today.
So I will start. So for me, it was the research experience was very essential for me as preparing myself to a PhD. I had the opportunity to participate in internships, and also was part of an association that promotes science in Puerto Rico. So when I participated as part of the association, I participated on local symposiums. So I had the opportunity to present my research locally, and I had an additional experience presenting at an international conference that really how do you call the people that speak PhD? When recruiters are looking for PhD students, they are looking into like broader impacts and how you engage with this. It's very important for them too. That's what makes you like successful, I think, particularly coming out of our undergrad.
I really want to second everything you just said there. I mean, really the biggest things that a recruiter is looking for is your ability to do research and talk about what research you've done, because the entirety of a PhD is, can you do research for 4 to 6 years and turn out something productive at the end of it that you can then go on to present to the world. And so for me, I knew really early on that I wanted to go ahead and get a PhD. So I started looking for research opportunities as early as my first year. I joined the STARS program. I did research under the first year summer research fellowship and the Yale College Dean's Fellowship. And then I continued that with a research intensive thesis through the Molecular Cellular Developmental Biology department. And another year after graduation working as a research technician. And then beyond just the research itself, I also took the opportunity to present everything I was doing at things like my college, Ezra Stiles Mellon Forum, and then also sought out leadership roles because part of that presentation skills, part of working as a PI, if you're intending to go into academia, is also those soft skills. So I ended up working as the head FROCO for Ezra Stiles my senior year. And broadly speaking, it all boils down to research skills, presentation, and the soft skills that kind of wrap those up and allow you to sell those first two aspects.
Yeah, I definitely would echo what has been said so far about the PhD application is really looking at you, the way I often describe it, it's looking at you as a scholar, not as a person. So like that is different from, say, your Yale application, where you were really talking about the ways in which education and college would help you develop into a person by the time. And this was something that I definitely adapted between the first and the second round of applications. By the time you're applying to the PhD, what they really want you to demonstrate is that you have a concept of what research you want to do and that you can demonstrate the skills in order to do that research. I also want to be like very candid in that as a first gen low income person from a rural area, when I got to Yale, I did not have a plan or any kind of sense of how to even be successful at Yale, which I think is its own hidden curriculum. And so I was just trying to survive. I was just trying to figure out how to be a student and how to be successful in an environment that my previous environment had not prepared me for. And so there were things that by the time I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, I had to really start making up for the fact that I hadn't spent the 4 years doing that type of investment work that Josh was just talking about. Like for the humanities in particular, your letter of recommendation is really important. And I hadn't even known like the difference between taking a class with like a tenured professor versus a lecturer, or how that would matter in terms of like where I wanted to apply or who I wanted to work with at the PhD. And luckily in my case that I was able to make up for that with my writing sample and really invest a lot of time and energy into showing that I had like the critical thinking skills. And that's where like your thesis could be a really useful thing to repurpose into a writing sample. But I do want to also norm that this is an uphill battle and there's always more you can do. And even if you're not doing it, that doesn't in any way disqualify you from applying for a PhD. And you actually are exactly the type of people who should be applying, because these positions need to be more diversified.
Yeah, so those are two extremely complementary points, right? Josh listed this amazing resume of doing this, which led into this, which led into this, which is all applied direct research experience. And when I was in my junior year in college, I remember having classmates who had all of this lab experience. They were already working on a thesis, and I hadn't started yet. And it was daunting, it was terrifying, but it's not too late for you guys to start now. If you decide that this is the path that you want to pursue, even if your classmate is 2 or 3 years ahead, you still can make up for it. You still can, do a research experience after you graduate, either working as a lab technician, volunteering in some kind of research assistant capacity, working as a lab manager. And Lydia makes a very solid point that you definitely would benefit from more of your voices in all of our fields. 25% of PhD students have a parent who has a PhD. And that stat isn't surprising just because the privilege associated with being able to even do a PhD, that opportunity cost is massive, but it can pay dividends and you don't have to stay in academia. We want to get into this later on. We can talk about non-academic routes after the PhD, but for people with first-gen low-income backgrounds who need to make a lot of money after you graduate, you can. You decide not to go into academia. So don't be afraid. So transitioning, now you've been working your butt off and you're a very qualified candidate and you're trying to figure out, where do I apply? There are tons of programs, tons of schools, and something that people fail to realize about PhD programs is that they are much more dependent on the, say, the resources broadly defined of the lab than an undergrad experience would be. You can be going to a top 10 state school as an undergrad and be perfectly well taken care of, have all the resources in the world. With PhD, that's going to be a very different experience. And so I'd like to open up the floor for the panelists to please discuss in your field, in your area, how much does the grant or the funding mechanism that your university department or faculty advisor have that's paying your stipend influence the degrees of freedom you have in your research schedule and your ability to work with other folks in your department?
I can definitely say flat out, hard sciences are really expensive. In many ways, the biggest determinant of what you're going to be able to do during a thesis in my field is simply how much money your lab has to work with, whether that's NIH grants, foundation grants, or some other funding source. So often it's actually a good idea to, at the very least before you choose a lab, but possibly even when looking at faculty at various schools that you're considering applying to, it might be worth looking them up on the NIH grants database and seeing how much funding they have available. Traditionally, a small lab will want at least one large NIH grant like an R01 or something similar that can then go on to fund all of the PhD students and work going on in that lab. And the larger the lab gets, the more of that type of grant they're going to need to be able to support you as a student. Admittedly, I did not know that going into applications, and it just happened to work out. But I have learned, and now we're telling y'all so that hopefully you can do this kind of research ahead of time.
Yeah, I feel like that question is a little different for the humanities because we're not so grant funded in the same ways. I will say generally though, like if you are able to apply for like a pre-doctoral fellowship, that across the board will increase your likelihood of being accepted into a PhD program. So I don't know like if me getting the Knight Hennessy Fellowship impacted the decision, but I do know that my department has not had to pay for me for the past 3 years. And there are other fellowships like the NSF that's specifically like science oriented. So those are things that you can also be applying to simultaneously if you're looking for like an American PhD program. And then obviously there's like Rhodes and other fellowships that are available. I do want to spend a little bit of time though talking about like funding as in like stipend, like how much money you get as a graduate student. And I'm comfortable being very open about this, partly because we are currently set to go on strike tomorrow with our university to advocate for higher pay. And we currently, to live in the Bay Area, which is the most expensive place in the US to live behind New York City, are paid $50,000. And the university says that it is okay that over 50% of our stipend goes to rent. And that is both a reality, even at one of the most well-funded institutions in the country. like it is a complete, like a UC, for example, they also went on strike in 2022 and that raised their stipend to like $36,000 in the same area. So like that is definitely like part of the conversation for sure. At the same time that I can say like I definitely feel the precarity more so as a first gen person because I don't have the financial safety nets that the other people around me do. Um, but because we are first gen, that is also an advantage in the sense that like we are used to living in conditions like this. And $50,000 is double what my mother currently makes in Texas right now. So like perspective, but also I think it's an important part of the conversation for sure.
So I think that for me, I resonated with what Josh said because I didn't even look at the funding as what I was applying. But I do a terrible thing about not seeing myself up. Well, I'm actually a NSF graduate research fellow. And I actually got the fellowship and then after I got the fellowship, I first left waitlisted and then I got the fellowship and then it was accepted into the program. So I kind of like turned the tables and after that, while I was communicating with as a first year with other students, they were telling me that usually the students that have their own funding have more flexibility in terms of who they can work with because they are not tied to a professor. So
Yes, and an amazing thing about your fellowship is if you were to get into a fight with the president of Yale tomorrow and decide I'm done with this university, I'm going to Harvard, you take your money with you and they will accept you because you're a free student, free labor, right? So having a fellowship attached to you gives you so many more degrees of freedom in what you get to do with your own life. Just tying back this conversation to make it more personally relevant for you all. Let's suppose that you are really interested in the psychology department at Cornell, and there are 3 professors that you're interested in. And so you list them in your application, you spend 10 hours reading their papers, doing research on the program, you put together a perfect application, you name 3 professors, 2 of them aren't taking a student, and the 3rd one doesn't have funding. And so your application goes in the garbage with your $130 fee. That's going to happen. You need to make sure that the place that you're applying to have the capacity to accept you, and that the capacity to accept you is dependent on their ability to pay for you. And so whether that's grant funding, whether that's departmental or university funding, these are questions you need to have answered before you start putting your resources into investing in programs that couldn't take you even if you're the perfect applicant. So now you have your list of schools and you made sure that they're all taking students, they all have funding for you, and you're trying to put together your application. Every program, every department might have different pieces of the application required. There might be a personal statement, a research statement, usually a vita, sometimes GRE scores, letters of recommendation, of course. But if you could, we'd love to hear you all walk through the components of your application. And so if you could say the components, the intention of the information the component is trying to convey, and how long approximately it took you, a time investment, to make sure that it was as good as it could be. It's kind of a hard question for things like letters of rec, but just to give people a general idea of what do I even need and how much time should I budget?
I think that depending on the school, they usually ask for a personal statement and a research statement. Sometimes they ask in some sort of like both combined in one. And I think that the fact that I applied for the NSF fellowship helped me a lot. I originally wasn't applying to so that I'm not like the best example. So for me, it took me like a month just to write my personal statement and the research statement, and then I kind of like repurposed both statements. And I kind of like personalized. I never submitted the same thing, but I they all have shared the same ideas, and it helped me a lot. In terms of the statements that I needed to present for the applications, letters of recommendation, they usually ask for 3, but for the fellowship I needed 5, so I approached 5 professors, and from them, I kind of like make sure I applied at the end to 8 universities and make sure that none of them at the end wrote me like more than 3 letters of recommendation. Because at the end of the day, you feel like bad from asking them to write you letters. And I think for me, coming from Puerto Rico, I had to take the TOEFL exam. And I think, for instances, I had, so I didn't have like the best score, but it wasn't bad either. It was like enough for some universities, but for others, it wasn't. And in terms of that, I had like fee waivers denied because of it, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But I think that, what else? The GRE, I took the GRE just for taking it because some programs still ask for it, but some don't. And at the end of the time, I think it took me like a good month or 2 to have all these materials ready.
Tough question.
Yeah.
But you made it so much easier for Josh to answer.
Yeah, I mean, really set me up well. Same experience in the, every school asks for and or of a research and personal statement. The research statement was basically saying, here are the areas of research that I'm interested in. I wrote a very generic one to start with, describing educational background, my prior research experience in detail. Then I would mention specific faculty I was interested in working with, specific parts of the curriculum that seemed interesting to me. And then if a given university had interesting certifications that they offer, like Hopkins has a extra teaching certification you can tack on, I would always mention that in my research statement. And for each of the schools I applied to, I updated this to basically swap in, okay, well, let's put in Professor X, Y, and Z from this school instead. Otherwise, the thing was exactly the same. Then personal statement, not all of the schools that I was applying to actually required this, but the ones that did, they usually had specific prompts. I did have a general one that was themed around overcoming adversity from growing up in rural Pennsylvania on a farm, and the role that creating narratives had in my life. So that was kind of my general one that I would retool every time to cover roughly about half the applications I ended up doing. Finally, then with my letters of recommendation, I had 5 to work with. I had a joint letter from my dean and head of college from working as head Froco. I asked them to focus in on leadership, communication, soft skills, generally speaking. 1 from each of my 3 research mentors, and then a 5th one from a humanities professor who I was just really close with during my undergrad career. And I think in total, I spent like 3 months working on applications, but in fairness, I was applying to far too many schools since I was applying everywhere that my wife applied for medical school. I think it ended up totaling like 31 applications at the end of the day, which please, none of you, don't do that to yourselves. Just don't.
Yeah, and just to add some information that hasn't been shared already, you can apply for fee waivers. You need to talk, well, so one thing that is different for PhDs versus, say, like applying to law school, there is not a single application. They don't all use the same platform. They don't all have the same requirement links, which is really fucking annoying. And so I had a spreadsheet where I was tracking all of this, but that also means that they all had different requirements for how you could be approved for a fee waiver. And it's not just like requirements that the school is asking for. Oftentimes it was a letter from financial aid, but also like talking with Yale financial aid to get the required materials that could allow you to apply for free. That was a point of contention for me. I wrote an op-ed about it when I was at Yale because of something that a financial aid officer said to me. If you're interested, you can look it up. So that I think is one thing that was mentioned. I was working on applications from like the summer until December when they were due. And it was while I was working the second time around while I was working full time. So that was like very long days. I devoted most of my time to my statement of purpose, which, like others have mentioned, this unfortunately is not like a place that so they say, to talk about like your background or your positionality. But for me, that was actually central to my research interest. And so my thinking with including that in my statement of purpose was that if a university wasn't interested in having me where that was a part of my research statement, then I probably didn't want to be there. So that's another thing too. Like it's not necessarily a school doing you a favor. Like you are also doing like the work to become the expert in your given field. And I think that's something to step into.
Yes, so there were two interesting things there that were said that we haven't talked about enough yet. And the first was something that Josh mentioned, which was when he was putting together his letters of recommendation, he went up to professors and asked them to speak about specific things in the letter, right? So if you're getting 3, 4, or 5 letters and you go to 3, 4, or 5 professors and say, hey, could you write a letter on my behalf? The likelihood that there's going to be a bunch of semantic overlap and maybe even overlap in skills or traits is going to be quite high. If you're trying to round out your application more, then you're going to want to have one professor that knows you better in your research world and say, talk about my experience in research. Another person who can talk about your experience as a leader, another person talking about your experience facing adversity. And so together you can have 3 different flavors such that when the admissions committee is reviewing these letters, they're not redundant, they're actually additive. Another thing was something that Lydia mentioned, which was that she was rejected the first time around. And this is a very common experience. It took me 3 application cycles to get into the PhD program that I wanted. And you know, the first time, you know, oftentimes it's just ignorance. There are so many things you don't know. The second time, you know, there could be different factors at play. Maybe you get accepted somewhere, but you don't necessarily want to be there, or you try to hedge your bets and you'll do a master's program in between before you finally get, you know, the one that you were hoping for. But these kind of experiences are not abnormal. They're actually quite common. And so it's something that you're going to want to have in mind. You know, for psychology, the year that I applied, we had 15 admittances out of 1,030 applicants. And of those, half of them had a graduate, an NSF graduate research fellowship. So it's extraordinarily competitive, and that makes it challenging, but I think most of us would agree that it's worth it. So those were the main questions that I had outlined to structure our conversation. Now we want to open it up to the audience to have some specific questions that might be in the back of your mind, something that you know, you've been itching to get other perspectives on. And you know, those can be for specific panelists. Maybe you're in the physical sciences and you have a question just for Josh, or you're in the social sciences and a question just for Francisco. But they also may be just general questions for the panel. So we'll open up the floor. Please.
Actually I have 2 questions, but the first one is for Lydia. She was talking about like how when she was looking for the letters of recommendation, she didn't know like the difference between taking a class with a tenured professor and a lecturer. Could you expand on that? Because I also.
Were you able to hear that?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I'm also like super happy to talk about like any hidden curriculum things that come up in this conversation, or if you want to email me after the fact. Like I think it's really important to share knowledge. One thing that I didn't know was what the faculty structure was like engaging with courses at Yale and how that would potentially impact the people who I could ask for letters as I was going into applying for the PhD. So like the general structure in terms of like who is teaching a course. So you would have grad students teach courses. They are typically like your TAs or TFs. Lecturers are people who are in non-tenure track positions. Oftentimes those people are really temporary positions. They don't receive the benefits that tenure gives to faculty. And that unfortunately is often seen as having less prestige than a letter from someone who is in a tenure track or a tenured position. So like TF, lecturer, then you have the professor structure, which is assistant professor, which are professors in the first 7 years of their progress where they are trying to get tenure. They have not been given tenure yet, so those are tenure track. And then you have associate professors who have been granted tenure, but they're new to their tenure, so they haven't had it for a while. And then you have full professors who their title would be listed on the department webpage as professor or distinguished professor. And then there are endowed positions, but you will still see that word professor. And endowed positions just means that they get paid more than everyone else. And then the other one is emeritus. And those are people who no longer are teaching, but are still being paid because tenure is a lifetime payment, I think. I think that is what my current understanding of the structure is. And I did not know that when I was taking classes. And I also didn't really understand it even when I was applying. And I think that's important also as you're looking at who you're going to work with at the other institution, because typically the people that you're supposed to be working with are tenure track or tenured professors, so not lecturers. Yeah, because they're more stable positions.
Yes, and the social networking aspect of that, the more you think about it, the more self-evident it becomes, right? If there's a full professor who has students that they graduated 10 years ago from Yale and now they're faculty at Dartmouth, you apply to those faculty members at Dartmouth and you have their former advisor writing your letter of recommendation. If it's a pretty good letter, the likelihood that they're going to throw away all the other students is pretty high, which means being at a place like here can work in your favor. It makes it pretty tough for students from state schools or from international schools, but you have that capacity to leverage it right now, so you certainly should be.
And the one caveat I would add to that is there also is like a difference between choosing a letter for someone who can actually talk about you and your research versus choosing a letter for name only. So that's definitely like a calculus to just keep in mind. Like it isn't always like a hard and fast, like a more tenured person is the better letter.
Okay, I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm hoping that like other people will ask them, so I'm not just sitting here asking a bunch of questions. But I wanted to ask a question to you. I'm a psychology undergrad senior, hoping to do a psychology PhD. And you mentioned that in your application cycle that there was like 1,000 people who applied and for 15 spots. And so in terms of like what in your experience, like working with these people, having them as your peers, like what do you feel like distinguished yourself and them in that very big pool of applicants?
Yes.
I know you mentioned, for instance, it's important to have professors that are doing research that you're interested in, that you're interested in building on, or is adjacent to what they're working on, and that being a factor. But and then also we mentioned like we experience all these things, but I mean, I think even within the pool of psychology seniors at Yale this year, there are a lot of people who meet those criteria. And so like when you're looking at this big wide pool, what do you think helps people stand out?
Yes. So it's certainly the case that there's a big pool and that there's a very strong funnel. And what's interesting is as you're getting, if you perform well and you're lucky, then you'll get interviews. And the interviews, most of the time, are formalities. By that point, at the lowest opportunity, you have a 50% chance of acceptance. Some, they don't take you for an interview unless they're ready to accept you, which is really the norm. But while you're at your interviews, you'll find that it's the same faces that you saw at Vanderbilt, at Duke, at Chicago, the same people that you're seeing at the interviews at Yale. And so what ends up happening is it's a funnel that has a ton of randomness in it, but you keep seeing the same faces. And so there is definitely an underlying latent pattern. And for psychology specifically, and this might be generalizable to the empirical sciences in general, but it requires having a very strong grasp on research, and that can most reliably be demonstrated through experience. And so that means not only do you have to have the experience, but you have to be able to make it abundantly clear. And so one thing that I learned in my final successful round of applications, where I was admitted everywhere, was in your personal statement, you can use underlines and bolds and italics to draw attention to your successes. You can have a narrative in which you're saying, I was working in this lab, we were working on these concepts and employing these methods, and then underline, and it resulted in 2 conference presentations and 1 publication. And that makes it so abundantly clear, because these faculty, you're writing 1,000 words, sometimes 500 words, and they have 45 seconds to read it, right? So if the only things that are popping out are publication, conference presentation, even if that's everything you've ever done, we're capitalizing on the availability heuristic, right? So making it as available as possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, gives you more options.
Yes.
This kind of question for you and also for Lydia. Because you mentioned you applied 3 times, Lydia applied 2 times. What did you do in the time in between, and what exactly did you change? Like, did you keep some of the same letters of recommendations? And if you didn't, who do you ask later? Because like you could ask the same professors from university, but by then it would probably been like at least a year longer. So did you ask them again? Do you ask someone else from like work or something like that?
Yes, that is a really, really important question. So when I graduated, I had $800 in my bank account and I needed to get a job. And so I ended up getting the worst possible job I could find to be as motivated as possible to conduct research and write papers and get stuff out in the evenings. And so I was working in an office, it was dingy and horrible. And then in the evenings I would go home and I would write my little pathetic undergraduate research and then send it out to like international journals, and they loved it because they're getting attention from a student, whatever. So essentially tying up those loose ends and being active in the academic community. I went to a couple conferences during that time. Being unaffiliated with the university makes it tricky, but if you email the people who are running the conference, oftentimes they can find money for you, which is fabulous. And then who did we ask for letters? So I can answer this question first, Lydia can go next, but I invested all of my resources into a lecturer because I didn't realize that it was such a big deal to be focusing your resources. I didn't have that knowledge. And so she knew me extremely well. She knows me extremely well and was very supportive. And so I've maintained her support and her letter through all of my applications. The first time around, I asked other folks who knew my capabilities very well in an academic sense, but not in a research sense. And so I shifted to folks that I conducted more empirical work with. And I've maintained these contacts over the years. If you send someone an email once every quarter, that's more than enough to keep in contact with them professionally. What do you think, Lydia?
Yeah, I didn't do any of that. So I just want to say that it's okay if you're not. It's okay. Like I didn't know, but I think that's good advice to like be active academically and in intellectual spaces. So the first time I got rejected, I was pretty devastated. I think as Yale students, we're used to being accepted to things, right? Like that's the whole reason why we got into Yale in the first place. So it was a good reality check to realize that I am not guaranteed anything. But it also was like, how do I deal with this devastation of me feeling like I had poured so much of myself into this application process and that it wasn't successful? My full-time job for the year in between was luckily, fortunately, at Dwight Hall. So I was still, for the most part, local to New Haven. And in terms of, so I didn't do anything different academically. The only thing that I worked on was like improving my application. So I just had my full-time job and then I had my application. And there were things that I did at Dwight Hall that I think I was able to put into that narrative. So like one of the events that we did while I was at Dwight Hall was we had the person who is the head of the Mellon Foundation, which is a really big humanities funder, speak. And so that was something that I was able to talk about. But in terms of letter writers, I definitely did switch who I asked the second time around to intentionally target tenured faculty who I had taken classes with. Some of them who I had taken classes with senior spring, so they weren't even people who I could have asked for a letter because I applied the first time senior fall. And I mainly like emailed them. Like their tenured faculty are incredibly busy people. So it wasn't like we were meeting regularly, even though I was in the vicinity. And they also know that this is part of like our commitment to academia, that this is part of the labor that we do, that we write each other letters of recommendation. So I did change to tenured faculty. And while I was talking to them, it did come up that they knew people at the institutions that I was applying to, and they invited me to apply to specific institutions. So that's where it kind of like, it can be a resource. Like you can talk with them to think through like what would potentially be the best fit for you. And in terms of the humanities, that's really like who is doing similar work to you. That you could potentially work with, and they would definitely know because they're active in the field.
I have a question, and this could go for anyone, I guess, but for context, I am a neuro major, but what I want to do is in the neuropsych clinical realm. You spoke about kind of keeping active in the academic world and going to conferences and things like that. And I haven't gotten a chance to go to a conference because in my lab that funding goes to like more senior undergrads and postgrads. So like can you expand on like being active in it and like what's enough,
Yeah. So first off, there are pockets of money hidden in all kinds of places. And that kind of money is actually the most exciting because when you put it on your resume, people haven't seen it before. And so when I applied to Yale, I had received 27 grants, awards, and or fellowships. And these were awards and fellowships and no one had heard of, right? I was the only guy applying to them. So you can find $500 here, $500 here, and use that money to go to the conferences. And they could be conference specific, or they could be university specific, departmental specific. But the harder you have to look to find it, the more likely it is that you'll be able to win. So I would say invest resources in that area. In addition, you also can be leveraging just networking in general in an academic sense, right? So when my advisor at Yale, I started, courting her 3.5 years before I was accepted, in which I had identified, 6 months before I applied the first time and said, hey, this is research that I'm quite interested in. It has a great reputation. I should email her and establish a relationship. And that worked. And then every time a paper came out of the lab, I read it. And then I emailed her and I said, it's interesting because of this, but it's horrible because of X, Y, and Z. and faculty love that because no one reads their work, right? It's very rare to have someone actually read your work. And so when someone does that and then makes the extra effort to reach out to you, that means a lot. It's very impactful. And so you could be staying in touch with the academic community through the former way in which you're actively in their face at a conference, winning awards. or it could be through the latter way, mature, just sliding the DMs on email.
I had a question more for Josh. I'm in bioengineering, so that sort of seems like it's the best fit. I'm a senior, applying this fall, and I have been applying to like outside funding, like an NSF and then the DoD and everything. And I was wondering about like, okay, so I know that professors don't keep their lab websites up to date at all. So like going about like emailing them to make sure that, hey, you have funding. How did you go about doing that? And would you mention like, oh, and I'm also applying for these fellowships. I haven't necessarily gotten them yet. I'll find out in April, but just sort of like, how are you structuring that initial contact with these professors?
So I just straight up cold emailed people. Like literally, I found their email and just sent them a, hey, I am a student from Yale, first gen. I am interested in potentially working in your lab if I would be coming to do graduate school at whatever institution you're at. And definitely mention that you are attempting to get funding, because even if you don't end up getting it, it looks really good that you have been trying to get it, because the kind of people who are applying to get funding independently are the kind of people who are likely to get their own grants within grad school, which takes the funding burden off of the lab. And particularly in the sciences, you can actually look up like who has what grants on the NIH website. I don't remember the specific URL, but you can literally search up by PI name and institution what grants they currently have and see what funding they have available. And the NIH actually does keep that part, at least, very up to date.
But I think I might still use that as an excuse to just like email them and have them respond to me instead of just like reading the email.
Yes, like please do just cold email them. But if you are worried about their funding specifically, that is a thing that is publicly available information.
And then you're tacking on like your CV, and that's pretty much it, right? It's a blurb and then your CV.
Yeah, it's basically, here is who I am and here's my resume.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
And if you want to really impress them, find their grant before you email them, read it, and then, skim it. Ask ChatGPT to remind you. Right, back in my day, it was harder.
I will definitely second that. It doesn't even
Yes.
have to be their grants. Pick like the most recent 3 papers that came out of their lab and skim the abstracts.
Yes, but if it's an active grant, you can actually email them and say, hey, I'm interested in performing the aims that you have in this grant.
Okay.
And you worked so hard to write this to make the money, but you had no student to do it. I could be that student. And that's a blessing.
You're definitely a psych. Like, I don't have these people skills.
Yes, let them help them in letting you help them.
Help them spend all their grant money.
That too.
And even if you're interested in a lab that it's not accepting PhD students. For me, for instance, my lab wasn't accepting students when I applied, but I got the fellowship and I was accepted.
And it opens up,
Yeah.
like, I remember like you mentioning that like if you put on a bunch of labs that aren't accepting people, they're gonna throw yours in the trash. So I would rather like maybe put a secondary lab so that they don't just like completely like don't look at my application. But definitely good advice. Thank you.
So I'm currently applying, I'm a sophomore by the way. I'm currently applying for like paid some research, like experiences and fellowships, particularly towards like underrepresented students. And when it comes to the personal statement, I'm not sure like basically what I'm supposed to talk about. Like I know that Josh, you mentioned in your PhD once that you mostly talked about like how research and like a little bit about yourself. But I was wondering if that differs like for like undergraduate research professors and if any of you did any study.
So I did a lot of applying to undergraduate research stuff. And again, it was just cold emailing professors. What I would always advise to people when I was talking to my first years as a Froco about like how I got into research in undergrad, I would literally just open up whatever PI I was interested in talking to's most recent publication, read over the abstract and just ask them, hey, I saw this thing in your paper. I thought it was interesting. Could I talk with you about the possibility of doing research in your lab? Could I come to one of your lab meetings? Asking those kinds of basic introductory questions to get a sense of who they are, and then saying, once I've met with them, if I was actually interested in doing what research they were doing, I would talk about, oh, hey, there's this thing called the Yale College Dean's Fellowship. So I would be fully funded over this coming summer. So you wouldn't have to pay me. Could I do research in your lab? Much in the same way as like the NSF, it works for grad school, things like the Yale College Dean's Summer Research Fellowship, the first year Summer Research Fellowship, those really work to let people who might not have the money to take on a student take you on anyways.
And this is like secondhand advice, but my partner did his PhD at Yale in the hard sciences and MCDB. And he's currently a postdoc at Harvard. And it is 100% okay. And you will probably more likely get a response if you email a grad student or a postdoc. Like, especially if you have funding, and they will have more time to work with you. They will be the people actually working with you in the lab.
Oh, you didn't, I don't know if you heard the first part of my question, but I was also wondering, like, if you're applying to like research, like summer programs basically, when you're writing your personal statement, what are you supposed to emphasize?
I think professionally, what has led you into following your research path and why the research that you're doing is relevant and why it doesn't matter to you.
I believe the Office of Career Strategies, OCS, has a template or two that tells you about the semantic structure. Because there's a pretty firm structure on personal statements that the reader is expecting. You know, the first paragraph should be an introduction, then it's talking about experience, and then a selling point. There are specifics on how that is mostly standardized.
Okay. I wanted to ask about like getting research opportunities after you graduate. I know you mentioned like volunteering in labs or working as a lab manager, but how and where can you find those types of opportunities?
Yes, so this is something that is super important because it's a lesson that can only be learned the hard way or if someone else did it the hard way. But when you see a lab manager position, you'll often see flyers in professional society listservs. You might see it in a departmental email chain. All of those are being advertised because by law, they must be. You cannot have an institution that's receiving money from the federal government that creates jobs but doesn't allow the public to apply for jobs. That said, most of them have a candidate before the job posting is made, which means people like us are going to spend 15 hours researching Villanova University about this specific lab so that we can send in an application to work as a lab manager for the 2-year commitment, knowing that, while they know that the application is going to go in the garbage because they're not going to read it because they already know who's going to have that job. And so when you're looking for a lab manager position or a research assistant position, the best way to do that is through networking. If you're going the cold way, going the hard way, it's really, really challenging. So in my junior year of undergrad, I didn't know this, and I really wanted to do a summer internship. And so I applied to every single summer position, research assistant position available throughout the entire United States. And I started applying in January and applied to everything that popped up until April when I was too depressed to keep applying. I think I had like 60 applications. They all required letters of recommendation. They all required personal statements, and none of them were read, except for one. One was read, and that one ended up turning into an interview where I was rejected. But she had a friend at Harvard, and so I ended up working at Harvard for her friend. But that's just dumb luck. And that, looking back, is not the way you should be playing. You really want to be going in back door because the front door often is locked.
Could you go into like more of the specifics of what that looks like?
Yes, yes. So it could be something as what year are you?
I'm a senior.
A senior. Okay. So it could be something as simple as talking to the grad affiliates at your college, finding one that is in the field that you're interested in, and ask them if they know any other grad students that are working on a project that could use an extra hand. That would be one path. Another path could be looking at the department in which you're interested, look at the postdocs there. The postdocs are often, just as capable as the junior faculty, but they have so much more time on their hands because they don't have to teach. And they have no one relying on them, which means they have all the degrees of freedom in the world. And so if you were to email them and offer them, free labor, and then, once the PI picks up on that, they'll say, okay, it can't be free labor, we have to pay them. And then you kind of sneak in that way. Those opportunities exist as well. And even if they don't exist today, they can exist tomorrow if you are persistent.
Follow-up question is to that, like in terms of like gap years and like expanding like your research and like getting a publication out before you apply. I had a very like blunt conversation with like a psych professor the other day that's like you need to be published in order to like get accepted to like very competitive programs. And so like using like your first or second or just like whatever like gap year to like get those publications out, like would the best way to do that be through a lab manager position since it's like you're tied to the lab and you have like research and like that sort, or like is it like, do you think you have a good luck, like, balancing it with like a real world job, or like, how can you kind of like find like the best like gap year opportunity that kind of like optimizes like your ability to like perform and like, like get a good app out there?
Yes.
I think is like kind of what I'm asking.
Yes. So one of my students just graduated from Davenport last year.
Yeah.
And she has a real job now. And we have 2 out of 3 studies done for a paper. And I already told her exactly what we need to do for this study. She just has to be the one to do it.
Yeah.
And it's really challenging for her because she has a lot of responsibilities on her plate. And so if you are going the, real job route and then during that trying to keep up, even with persistent grad student and persistent advisor trying to help you, it's a lot. What I would recommend is the lab manager route is nice because the average pay is like 55 grand a year, not bad, right? So you'll be able to live. It's enough to live, for a lot of us, as Lydia said, a lot of us is more than our parents make, so that's pretty good, right? We're used to living on not much, so you can do it. And if you're going to do a PhD, you will do it. So that's fine, it's character building. An alternative opportunity set is going the master's route. Now, never pay for a degree, but there are fully funded master's programs. Yes, don't pay for master's degrees. The ones that you pay for are scams, especially Columbia University. There is a Washington Post article about this in 2021. They take international money and they give you a worthless piece of paper so you can go back. It's really not good. Find the degrees in which they're paying you or you have no tuition at a minimum. In our field, in psychology and neuro, there are 2 programs. There's William & Mary, which is the best, and then Wake Forest, which is number 2. I went to William & Mary, after I graduated, I was accepted everywhere. One of my classmates went to Oxford, the other went to Columbia. There are programs that are designed to make you into the best student, the best candidate possible. So that when you transition, you can have a good legacy for the school. And other departments have them too, presumably you just have to find them. And the stipend was 17 grand a year, so you will starve, but it's okay. It's character building.
Is that with housing included?
There's no housing. $17,995, but it's in Virginia, so that's basically rich. I mean, I lived alone, my rent was $1,000 a month, but
And you still fed yourself.
I did,
Okay, good.
lost a lot of weight.
And as you were a master's student, you were like doing like your PhD apps again and again, or like you waited until after and that was like the 3 year, like where was
Exactly.
your timeline?
Exactly, so, gap year.
Yeah.
And then 2 years in the masters.
Okay.
But when the masters should be your backup, right?
Okay.
So I was admitted to Columbia and UVA, and I didn't like either of them, so I went to Lancaster.
Okay.
And then afterwards, I applied, I didn't apply. So,
This is a question for Lydia, or like obviously if anyone else can answer also, but I'm also in the English department here and interested in potentially applying for a PhD in English. And I was wondering because, or for like the sciences, it seems like research is really important, but I know in the humanities, like research is like different. And I was wondering, I guess, like how essential having research experience before applying is, and like if there are ways to, as you said, like personal statements are, or like it's like more about your academic interests, and if there's a way to kind of like show your academic interests without like the like kind of hard science research that's like in other PhD.
Yeah, research in the humanities and in English is like the papers that you're writing in class. So I think the most important thing in terms of preparing for a PhD in the humanities is your thesis. That's like probably one of the longest pieces of like sustained scholarship that you would be writing before going into the PhD, and that's really good evidence that you can do it. In terms of like other things that I think helped my application, I was a writing tutor at the Poorvu Center. I did a lot of work with the Poorvu Center. Over COVID, they had a program where I was paired with specific classes. And so it almost became like a writing TA position where I was like regularly meeting with the same students. And that was like a super valuable experience for me in terms of teaching experience. Another thing you can do at Yale, especially for the humanities, but for any of the like programs that you would be applying to, is YYGS, Yale Young Global Scholars. That's a teaching opportunity. And that's over the summer, and they pay you, and they also give you housing in New Haven. So those are all things that I did that I was grateful for having done, and that I think helped my application.
Lydia, I know you have to leave soon. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, just thank y'all for coming. Thank you for considering applying to a PhD. And if anyone has any other questions for me, humanities related or just hidden curriculum PhD related, please feel free to email me. My email is just my last name @stanford.edu. But yeah, thanks so much, Michael, and everyone for organizing this.
Thank you for your time.
Michael, before we leave, I just wanted to also let you all know that there are a lot of resources here at Yale to help guide you through the PhD program. And a few of them that I want to mention, one is, while many of you may know about our academic strategies mentors in the OEO, we also have a group of graduate students who serve as mentors. And we have several in many different disciplines. And if you are looking for just some advice similar to what Josh and Lydia and Francisco have given you, you can always contact them. Just reach out to our academic strategies email address and say, I'm thinking about applying to PhD programs. We actually also have somebody, if any of you are interested in law, we have a current law student and we have a current MPH student. So if you're interested in public health, there are two great resources for that. In addition to the resources that are at OCS, you know, in terms of their website, but they also have, especially in the sciences and for the health professions, they have specialists working and helping students who are applying to grad school. There also may be these little pockets of money about to go to conferences. There are different places that you can apply to even here at Yale. The other thing for conferences too is they're always looking for volunteers to work the conferences. So sometimes you can volunteer at a conference and get to go for free. And sometimes there are conferences here that are happening at Yale that you can contribute to. So I just want to say that there are a wide variety of people that you can ask for help and guidance here at Yale, as well as maybe some assistance financially to navigate this system. And the Office of Educational Opportunity, we're one of those places you can get started. So, and also I have my PhD in humanities, so I'm happy to talk, and it was in English, so I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested in that as well.
Well, I wanted to thank all of you, and Nick, this has been a great session, and the students can stay as long as you all are available. But I know we run over time, and I just want to make sure that if someone has to be somewhere, that they are able to do that, but also enjoy the food, but also come up and mingle, speak to the people who are here in the room. There's a lot of good information that you can get in addition to what you've already heard so far. But again, I want to congratulate the panel. They've done an excellent job in setting across some very useful information. So thank you. Please join me with a round of applause for them. And very quickly before we continue or end, depending upon how Nick wants to proceed, we have Barb Potasio and Liz Chapman on the line if you want to say hello.
Barb, go first.
Hi, I'm Barbara Tassie. I'm a vice president of 1stGenYale. I'm so glad that you were able to come, that you felt, I hope, free to ask your questions that you may be reluctant to ask in another venue, and that this is the chance to ask all your questions from these folks who can help you after they've been in the same booths that you have. And so please take advantage of this to do that. I'm so glad you're here tonight, and good luck to you in your applications.
Thank you, Barb. Hi, I'm Lisa Chapman, class of 81 MBA. I wish I'd gotten a PhD, but I didn't. I have a master's from Yale and a master's in counseling. I think this was just a fantastic program. It took about 9 months to create. I want to thank Nick for really coming up with this idea and spearheading it, and Michael for your leadership and hosting this event. I mean, this is our very first hybrid. So we've never done this before. We've never been in person and also virtual at the same time and all being recorded. So we're going to have a recording for everyone who was not able to attend. So you guys created a new opportunity and chapter for us to create different and more events that are mixed. So this is fantastic. I want Karen Gosling, I want to thank you again for all your support and leadership and belief in us and hosting us in your beautiful facility. And Annie and Jackson, our two comrades on the ground, who helped put all this together and all the pieces. I hope I haven't missed anyone, but if I have, I apologize, but thanks again. And really, Michael and Nick, you did a phenomenal job creating this opportunity, an informative session of what are the nuts and bolts of how to get a PhD. I wish we all had had this earlier. I certainly, if I had known this earlier, I probably would have gone for a PhD and not just a master's. So thanks for opening up our eyes and ears to these opportunities and how to be successful in finding your goals. Michael, back to you.
Thank you. Nick, you can decide how you want to proceed. You want to take a couple of remaining questions or make some closing remarks or just start mingling with the group? It is up to you, Nick.
Yeah, I think that right now would be a pretty good time to close down into a more informal one-on-one style where people can enjoy some food, make sure none of it goes to waste. I think there are also some sparkling beverages in the back. And we can hang around for as long as we can. I could probably stay another 15 minutes or so, and if anyone has any questions, whoever is able to stay would be happy to answer.
Yes, thank you.
So I think we should end the recording, Michael. Is that what we should do, and let them continue
fine.
without us
can do that.
recording them, eating and then.
That sounds right.
And Nick, if there are any questions for Josh, he might be here for a few more minutes before he has to go.
Yes, I'll be around for a few more minutes,
And
but
so
also
Josh, I'm gonna leave
if
you on. I will go silent again. Barb and I are both silent, but we're on, so we'll turn it off when you're finished, Josh. And Michael,
But,
you gonna stay around? Michael, you're gonna stay
Yep,
around?
I'm here.
Okay, okay, that's great. Okay, thank you. And I
Uh,
just put in the chat for anybody with questions. Feel free to email us, 1stGenYale at 1stGenYale.org, and we'll be glad to connect you. Josh, thanks for putting your email in the chat. With Lydia, she gave you her email, but anybody else, we really want to connect. We have a lot of PhDs, alumni in 1stGenYale who I'm glad would like to chat with you also about their process.
Yep.
Good
And
night,
for
everyone.
those of you who aren't looking at the Zoom chat, my email is jbeal3@jh.edu. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions you might have. I would also be happy to put you in contact with some of the faculty here at Hopkins as a inroad if you're interested in potentially working with any of them.
It's a big offer.
And if anyone hasn't signed up or checked in, if you could, so that we can communicate back and forth going forward. So I'll leave the list up here and please help yourself to food.